one of the subplots that's quite important, both in terms of the larger plot, but also in terms of what the novel reveals to us on the part of its writer and what he thinks is important in Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle, is the, we could call it, complementarity or clash or supplantation of values, aesthetic values, life values by each other. And so we can talk about Wabi, which we'll get to in just a moment, and then Wu, and it all is provoked by the production and the sale eventually, gifting first, of one particular piece of jewelry designed by Frank Frink and sold by the Edfrank company, that they start to produce and sell original American jewelry. And so there's kind of a long, meandering process, but it's very interesting to see all the reflections that are built into this coming on the part of some of the characters, particularly Robert Childan, who's going to be the go-between, the intermediary, but also become somebody convinced, having some Anglo-Saxon fanaticism, as Tagomi is going to say. So we begin with Childan in the house where he's been invited of the Kasouras, Paul and Betty. They are a young, very stylish Japanese couple, forward-thinking, humane, and he goes into their place, and then we have these very interesting observations. So Betty meets Robert at the door. Mr. Childan entered. Bowing, he entered, tasteful in the extreme and so ascetic. Few pieces, a lamp here, a table, bookcase, print on the wall, the incredible Japanese sense of Wabi. It could not be thought in English. The ability to find in simple objects a beauty beyond that of the elaborate or the ornate, something to do with the arrangement. Now, of course, notice that it is being described in English. So, we have kind of a funny little paradox here. And he goes on, and after he's gifted them a scrimshaw, he says, here we go. Only now in this unrelated situation had he for a moment lost the sense that things were in the constant process of going askew. The Wabi around him, radiations of harmony. That is it, he decided. The proportion, balance. They, the young couple, are so close to the Tao, these two young Japanese. That is why I reacted to them before. I sensed the Tao through them, saw a glimpse of it myself. So there's sort of a transcendent experience that is happening here through his engagement with these two. And then he goes on, what would it be like, he wondered, to really know the Tao? The Tao is that which first lets in the light, then the dark, occasions the interplay of the two primal forces so that there is always renewal. It is that which keeps it all from wearing down. The universe will never be extinguished because just when the darkness seems to have smothered all to be truly transcendent, the new seeds of light are reborn in the very depths. That is the way. When the seed falls, it falls into the earth, into the soil, and beneath, out of sight, it comes to light. And so we've gone now from just this value or experience of Wabi to thinking about broader metaphysical issues of the Tao. And then what happens is Childan is going to take the jewelry coming from the Edfrank Corporation. Fortunately, he doesn't know that Frank Frink was the guy who came in and actually caused trouble at his shop. He takes it on consignment, which is kind of a loss in a way, a short-term loss for the Edfrank Corporation, composed of Ed and Frank, but it's going to turn out to have some really helpful consequences. Why that? Well, so Childan decides that he's going to do this in part because this can become a new line for him, where he doesn't have to worry about authenticity anymore. He can build up a stock of non-historic objects, contemporary work with no historicity, real or imagined. He's thinking about, adapting and the rule of survival, be there at the right time doing the right thing. And then he has an idea. He's like, ooh, I can gift this piece to Betty. Robert, of course, is attracted to Betty very much. And he's like, I'll graft a gift to Betty. And then he thinks a little bit more and he's like, I'd better do this through the intermediary of her husband, Paul, so it doesn't raise any suspicions. And he's like, this is going to be two birds with one stone, right? What are the two birds? He can use it as an excuse to engage more with Betty, perhaps even develop a romantic relationship with her. But, he says, it's also good for obtaining a high-place reaction. This is how a new line is introduced. Isn't it lovely? A whole selection back at the store. Drop in. This one's for you, Betty, right? So that sets up this very interesting conversation, which is going to take up a significant portion of chapter 11. Childan is going to have a discussion with Paul, and Paul tells him something very interesting about the piece. So first he says, Childan says, oh, maybe your wife didn't like the piece. I'm really embarrassed, And then Paul says, well, I didn't give it to my wife. And then Childan is thinking, ooh, maybe he knows what I'm trying to do. But Paul goes a different way. He says, I took the liberty of showing this to a number of business acquaintances, individuals who share my taste for American historic objects or for artifacts of general artistic, aesthetic merit. None, of course, had ever seen such as this before. As you explained, no such contemporary work hitherto has been known. I think, too, you informed that you are the sole representative. Do you want to hear their reaction? Childan bowed. These people laughed. Yet I, too, laughed behind my hand, invisible to you, the other day when you appeared and showed me this thing. Naturally, to protect your sang-froid, I concealed that amusement. As you no doubt recall, I remained more or less non-committal in my apparent reaction. Paul goes on, one can easily understand this reaction. Here's a piece of metal which has been melted until it has become shapeless. It represents nothing, nor does it have design of any intentional sort. It's merely amorphous. One might say it is mere content deprived of form. And here we get the very important turning point. Paul says, yet I have for several days now inspected it, and for no logical reason, I feel a certain emotional fondness. Why is that, I may ask? I do not even project into this blob, as in psychological German test, my own psyche. I still see no shapes or forms, but somehow it partakes of Tao. You see, it is balanced. The forces within this piece are stabilized, at rest. This object has made its peace with the universe. It is separated from it and hence has managed to come to homeostasis. So what is this at this point suggesting to us? Maybe this piece, created by an American, by Frank Frink, has Wabi. And then Paul goes on and says, it does not have Wabi, nor could it ever. But, Robert, this object has Wu. I believe you are right, Childan said, trying to recall what Wu was. It was not a Japanese word, it was Chinese. Wisdom, he decided, or comprehension. Anyhow, it was highly good. So Childan is like, this is great. At first I was worried, and now it seems like things are falling into place. So now Paul says something really interesting. Where does it get this Wu from? Well, from the hands of the artificer. Those had Wu and allowed that Wu to flow into this piece. Possibly he himself knows only that this piece satisfies. It is complete, Robert. By contemplating it, we gain more Wu ourselves. We experience the tranquility associated not with art, but with holy things. I recall a shrine in Hiroshima where the shin bone of some medieval saint could be examined. However, this is an artifact and that was a relic. This is alive in the now, whereas that merely remained. By this meditation, I have come to identify the value which this has in opposition to historicity. I am deeply moved, as you may see. to have no historicity, so that's one thing, and no artistic aesthetic worth, which seems to be bad, and yet to partake of some ethereal value, that is a marvel. Just because this is a miserable, small, worthless-looking blob, that contributes to its possessing woo. And he goes on and says, one experiences awareness of woo in such trash as an old stick or a rusty beer can by the side of the road. However, in those cases, the woo is within the viewer. It is a religious experience. Here is where something really new is happening. And artificers put woo into the object rather than merely witnessed the woo inherent in it. So he says, in other words, an entire new world is pointed to by this. The name for it is neither art, for it has no form, nor religion. What is it? I have pondered this pin unceasingly, yet cannot fathom it. We evidently lack the word for an object like this. So you are right. It is authentically a new thing. A new thing on the face of the world. And so he comes back to discuss this with Robert. And now we're going to get a very interesting proposition happening on the part of Paul, which is actually also a test, as Robert is going to realize, and an opportunity for something new to come into the world between them in human relations. So first he gives it back and he says, this is yours. You must face reality with more courage. The task is yours. You are the sole agent for this. Think about which way you're going to go. How are you going to put these objects over in a big fashion? And Childan says, the man is telling me I'm obliged to assume moral responsibility for the Edfrank Jewelry crackpot neurotic Japanese worldview, nothing less than number one spiritual and business relationship with the jewelry tolerable in the eyes of Paul Kasoura. And the worst part is that Paul certainly spoke with authority right out of the dead center of Japanese culture and tradition. And Paul then says to him, I have a colleague who you may want to talk to. And he says, I've written out his name and address. He's an importer. He imports and exports on a mass basis, especially to South America. He deals in immense quantity, perhaps tens of thousands of each item. And he says, pieces like this could be mass produced, either in base metal or plastic from a mold. And then Childan asks a very important question. What about woo? Will that remain in the pieces? And there's no answer. Paul doesn't say anything. And Paul says, I advise you to see them because these can be turned into good luck charms to be worn by relatively poor people, a line of amulets to be peddled all over Latin America and the Orient. Most of the masses still believe in magic, as you know. And Childan says, it sounds like there would be a good deal of money in it. And he asks, was this your idea? And Paul says, no. So Paul says, there's a chance for you to become extremely wealthy. Childan says, this seems bizarre to me, making good luck charms out of art objects. I can't imagine it. And then Paul says, well, it's not your natural line of business. You're devoted to the savored esoteric. Myself, I am the same. But don't undervalue the possibility suggested by the importer. You and I, we have no awareness of the vast number of uneducated. They can obtain from mold-produced identical objects a joy which would be denied to us. We must suppose we have the only one of a kind, or at least something rare, possessed by a very few, and of course something truly authentic, not a model or a replica, not something to be cast by the tens of thousands. And Childan says, aha, what's actually happening here? So it's a dilemma. What kind of person are you? He's actually saying, Childan thought, which are you, Robert? He who the oracle calls the inferior man, or that other for whom all the good advice is meant? You must decide here. You must trot on one way or the other, but not both. Moment of choice now. And which way will the superior man go? Robert Childan inquired of himself. And so he goes on and he thinks, Woo, as Paul would say, the woo of this situation is this. Whatever our personal dislikes, there can be no doubt the reality lies in the importer's direction. Too bad for what we had intended. We must adapt, as the oracle states. After all, the originals can still be sold in my shop to connoisseurs. Paul says, you wrestle with yourself. No doubt it is such a situation one prefers to be alone. And then Childan says, I will follow your advice. Now I will leave to visit the importer. And he thanks Paul for his business advice. But then Paul stops at the door and says, American artisans made this piece by hand, correct? Labor of their personal bodies. And he says, will they play along with this? Would they be persuaded? And Childan says, I'd hazard they could be persuaded. Paul says, yes, I suppose so. And then we see a second decision being made. Something in his tone made Robert Childan take sudden note. A nebulous and peculiar emphasis there, and it swept over Childan. Without a doubt, he'd split the ambiguity. He saw. The whole affair is a cruel dismissal of American efforts taking place before his eyes. Cynicism, but God forbid, he had swallowed hook, line, and sinker. So this is how the Japanese ruled, not crudely, but with subtlety, ingenuity, timeless cunning. And he goes on, he says, he's broken me. But he's also humiliated me and my race, and I'm helpless, where there's no avenging this. Childan is actually tempted to throw away the artwork. But then he does something. He says, Paul, I am humiliated. And Paul asks, why so, Robert? And he says, I'm proud of this work. There can be no consideration of trashy good luck charms. I reject. And he says, the men who made this are American proud artists, myself included. To suggest trashy good luck charms, therefore, insults us. And I ask for apology. Incredible prolonged silence. Paul surveyed him, one eyebrow lifted slightly, and his thin lips twitched, a smile. I demand, Childan said. That was all. He could carry it no further. Paul said, forgive my arrogant imposition. He held out his hand. All right, Robert Childan said. They shook hands. Calmness descended in Childan's heart. I have lived through and out, he knew, all over. Grace of God. It existed at the exact moment for me, another time otherwise. Could I have ever dare once more press my luck? Probably not. So, interestingly, they live through Wu and through the Tao in this situation. And Childan, who's been kind of in some respects, half good, half bad character, certainly given to being a conformist and, kind of, in some respects, a little scummy, has displayed himself to be the superior man. And he's done so not just on his own part, but by doing so in continuity, in solidarity with the artist who he's representing. And then we get one more thing, very interesting, one more vignette that takes place. This artifact is actually going to transport Tagomi to an alternate America. But before that, he has to acquire it. So he goes to Childan's store to turn in the Colt revolver that he has killed the two SD guards with. And Childan says, no, I'm not going to buy that back from you. But he does suggest to him, I want to show you something else, something of unusual interest. And so he does it, and he shows him the jewelry. And he says, these are American made, but these are not the old. These are the new. This is the new life of my country, sir, the beginning in the form of tiny imperishable seeds of beauty. Tagomi examines the pieces and he says, yes, there is something new which animates these. The law of Tao is borne out. Here where yin lies everywhere, the first stirring of light is suddenly alive in the darkest depths. We are all familiar. We've seen it happen before. And yet for me, these are just scraps. I cannot become wrapped as Childan here. Unfortunately for both of us, but that's the case. And he says, quite lovely. And Mr. Childan says, sir, it does not occur at once. Pardon? The new view in your heart. Tagomi says, you are converted. I wish I could be, I am not. And then Tagomi says, as Childan is pressing onward, he says, "Your Anglo-Saxon fanaticism does not appeal to me." Nevertheless, he felt a certain renewal of hope. And he says, "I will see you again one of these days. We can perhaps examine your prophecy." And then Tagomi changes his mind as he's leaving the store. He says, "What if I bought one of those odd, indistinct items, kept it, re-examined, contemplated? Would I have subsequently, through it, found my way back? I doubt it. Those are for him, not for me. And yet, even if one person finds his way, that means there is a way, capital W. Even if I personally fail to reach it, I envy him." These are all in Tagomi's mind. He turns back to the store. He buys one of them. He says, "I will buy one of these, whichever you select. I have no faith, but I'm currently grasping at straws." And so Mr. Childan says, "This will calm you." He laid out a single small silver triangle ornamented with hollow drops, black beneath, bright and light-filled above. "Thank you," Mr. Tagomi said. And he's going to sit there in the park contemplating the, as he calls it, the squiggle, right? And then he's going to have an experience, which we'll discuss elsewhere. So what we see, very interestingly depicted, articulated here, thoughtfully, in great detail, is how new jewelry by conquered peoples who are artisans is able to bring something both new and old into the world. Something new in its formless form, something old or eternal in its value of wu, that it is mediating, making possible for people to partake in. So, very important discussion that's taking place here on Philip K. Dick's part through the intermediary of his characters and their actions and attitudes.